we have my colleague, Professor Margaret Lavinia Anderson. She is a Professor Emerita of History at the University of California, Berkeley. She is working on manuscript on the Armenian genocide in Germany. We have already several very significant, lengthy essays about various aspects of that topic that she has published. She is the author of Windhorse, a political biography, Oxford University Press, Practicing Democracy, Elections and Political Culture in Imperial Germany, Princeton University Press. Many very significant articles in the top academic journals, be it in the US or in Europe. I won't mention some titles in German, for example. In the collective volume, A Question of Genocide, she has also an important article who still talked about the extermination of the Armenians, German talk and German silences. Today she will be presenting a paper entitled Responsibility to Protest, the public, the powers and the Armenians in the era of Abdul Hamid II, and it's a pleasure for me to welcome her here.
In the summer of 1889, London Daily News published a letter to the editor from William Gladstone, former Liberal Prime Minister of Britain and now leader of the opposition. Headlined Turkish Cruelties in Armenia, Gladstone's letter reminded readers they had a legal right by treaty to insist that the Ottoman Sultan suppress the cruelties committed against Armenians and to punish the perpetrators. Also reminded readers that this very newspaper had been instrumental in exposing similar atrocities in Bulgaria 13 years earlier, an exposure that had resulted in the destruction of Turkish rule there. Forgotten it was not, least of all by the Ottomans, nor was Gladstone's own role in that debacle. In 1876, pamphlet of his, The Bulgarian Horrors, that had been a battle cry. It had called on states of Europe, quote, to obtain the extinction of Turkish executive power in Bulgaria. Let the Turks carry away their abuses in the only possible manner, namely by carrying off themselves, their Zaptias and their Mudirs, their Bimbashis and their Yuzbasis, their Kaimkayans, their Pashas, all bag and baggage. And now, here was Gladstone again, railing against the Turks and demanding that his government, and I quote, freely avail themselves of the power of public opinion in the cause of humanity and justice. Gladstone's confidence in the power of public opinion in the service of human rights has retained its popularity to this day. In 2003, Samantha Power won a Pulitzer Prize making the same case in her book, A Problem from Hell. She made it negatively, that is, she said that ethnic cleansing and genocide are stopped only when large constituencies demand intervention. Unfortunately, vulnerable peoples are sacrificed by political leaders who follow their perceived national interest. And her first example in her preface was the sacrifice of Ottoman Armenians. The narrative of vulnerable peoples sacrificed to national interests of outside is a popular one, and perhaps nowhere more than in studies of the Armenian question. Turks and Armenians can agree on one thing at least, that Ottoman Armenians were, quote, victims of great power diplomacy. That's the title of two books, one by an Armenian and one by a Turk. But states, great and small, did have and will have important interests that are not necessarily reinforcing. Trade-offs are necessary every day. The problem for humanitarians and for vulnerable peoples is that only states have power. Now, in the lecture to follow, I will examine a moment when Western opinion did form the kinds of constituencies for intervention that both Gladstone and Samantha Power demanded. And they did so on behalf of Ottoman Armenians. And I pick as my starting point a famous trial in 1889 that signaled, perhaps, a watershed in European awareness of Armenian oppression, and perhaps also a turning point in Sultan Abdul Hamid's awareness of his Armenian population. I will then move to the massacres of the mid-1890s, paying attention to what we might call the anti-Gladstonian position, represented by some of today's social scientists, as well as an influential articulation, the views of William L. Langer. The thrust of my paper is unrelievably pessimistic, as I believe that the massacres of the 90s demonstrate the limits of coercive diplomacy. The source of the Armenian problem was neither the behavior of the Armenians nor of the great powers. It lay in the Ottoman Empire itself, where Armenians could not thrive without reforms, but where demanding and even implementing reforms would endanger their lives. And I hope to demonstrate this final point by a cross-Atlantic analogy in the end. Back to Gladstone's letter to the editor. That Britain's government, then headed by the conservative Lord Salisbury, investigate what was happening in Turkey. The latter had already published a blue book containing the reports of his consuls in Asiatic Turkey. Copies of this book were available to the public and sent to foreign offices across Europe. And over the next 8 years, the British government would issue 9 more such blue books, all on the terrible conditions of Ottoman Armenians. The focus of the 1889 book, however, was on one man, the handsome, young Kurdish chieftain Musa Bey, a poster boy for what was wrong in Turkey's anarchic East. With Musa Bey's band of merry men, he terrorized the Armenian villages in the plain of Mush, stealing sheep, hijacking caravans, snatching brides, and raping village women when their husbands were at work. His band's control of the highway between Mush and Bitlis could bring business to a standstill, and he had purchased the tax farm for his district, and so he had legal authority to extract taxes from whom he was making it impossible to pay. Now, if Armenians complained to civil authorities, his retaliation was sadistic. He released one plaintiff alive. Western ambassadors made representations, as they called it, to the Sultan, delicately calling his attention to his promises in the 1878 Cyprus Convention and Treaty of Berlin to introduce reforms to protect these people. Such protests may have led to Musa Bey's eventual arrest, but they did not prevent his almost immediate escape a few years later. The Mutasarrif who arrested him was then himself arrested, whether for allowing Musa Bey to escape or for arresting him in a hole in the first place isn't really clear. Now, so far, Musa Bey's story is only a rather more colorful version of what Armenians had been experiencing in the East for some time. But in May, the story takes a particular turn, because in May, about 500 Armenians had traveled all the way from Mush to Istanbul, to Constantinople, and began waving a petition and shouting and screaming in front of the Grand Vizier's office. It turned out that the approximately 200,000 Armenians in the capital itself showed their support. And these protesting Armenians began to play a card that they had not yet played before. They said if their grievances had not been met, were not met, they would seek another option, annexation. Now, Musa Bey himself had escaped, but he was repeatedly cited as he traveled across the country, more or less like a rock star. People would report, there he is, there he is, there he is. Eventually he showed up in the Capitol saying he wanted his day in court and promised to pay travel expenses for anyone who cared to come and testify. The trial provoked enormous publicity and an enormous reaction, for he was acquitted of all charges. And Europe's diplomats expressed extreme dismay. Here was the international community in action. The Grand Vizier himself made it clear he thought this was a travesty of justice, although maybe he was just under rival, the justice minister. The British ambassador was shaken. The German ambassador, who was certainly no bleeding heart, called this a blatant mockery of the law. Now, European governments at this time had not espoused anything like the 205 UN Declaration of Responsibility to Protect, which proclaims that if a state is manifestly failing to protect its population, the international community has a responsibility to do so for it. But the reaction of the diplomats did show a kind of unwritten R2P, a responsibility to protest. And protest they did. And the cooperation among the great powers, usually presented as rivals, is really quite remarkable here. Salisbury and Bismarck worked together, hand in hand, and they were joined by other ambassadors as well. I can't find much on France, but I think they were just following the Russian lead, and the Russians were the least eager to take a public stand, although privately they had the same opinion. Some weeks later, even the United States would protest, but separately, because this was a potentially awkward situation for the United States, given its own conspicuous failure to protect the colored population of its own Armenians. Bismarck's role may surprise. His indifference to what happened in the East, except insofar as it might be of destabilization among the powers, was proverbial. When he was asked at a parliamentary dinner what Germany desired in the Orient, he had sighed, "It's what I tell my wife every Christmas when she asks me what I want." Answer, "Can't think of anything." Bismarck had no idea of the Ottoman Empire, but he was convinced it had no future unless it reformed. "This is your last chance," he told the Ottoman plenipotentiary at the Congress of Berlin, "and if I know you, you won't take it." Now, I'm not claiming that the powers' near unanimous protests to the Sultan were yet a response to public opinion, so beloved by Gladstone. His own letter was only 2 column inches, and it was really overwhelmed by the reports on the great dock workers' strike that summer. Everywhere there were other issues pushing the Armenian one off the stage. Of all of Europe's leaders, the one most concerned with public opinion at this time was Abdul Hamid, and he collected newspaper clippings like mad. His archives are full of them. But the public that mattered most to him was not, of course, in Europe. The multicultural Ottoman Empire was no longer immune to identity politics, and there is every indication that the Ottoman Muslims welcomed Musa Bey's acquittal as a stick in the eye of Turkey's critics. Famous acquittals of guilty parties have done the same in our own day, we may remember. The Sultan was convinced that any retrial, which Salisbury was pressing for, would encourage Armenian revolutionaries and create the worst possible impression in the Muslim world, leading to acts of revenge against himself. With a conviction this firm, no appeal to what Europe conceived as his interest could move him to hand over the Kurd, much less to monkey around with customary relationships, we call it reform, which would be seen at home as kowtowing Armenians who were Europe's proteges. Now, could the powers have forced the Sultan to do otherwise? The history of the 1880s demonstrated both the paucity of choices and the futility of exercising them. The powers had worked in concert. They had delivered collective notes. They had tried to pressure the Sultan into honoring his promises at Berlin. And acting independently, Britain had threatened force, deployed the fleet near Constantinople, and with frequent references to Bulgaria, had raised the prospect of withdrawing its promise to support the Cyprus Convention guaranteeing Turkey's Asian possessions. These steps did succeed in angering the Sultan. There's questions for the Armenians. But now Europe's public opinion was coalescing. Quite suddenly, the British press began to devote significantly more column inches to the Armenians. The Times, which had published only 7 items in the first 1990, doubled that number in the second quarter and increased it by a factor of 10 in the third. More significant from Abdulhamid's point of view, over the course of the summer, the Times began increasingly not to refer to the Armenian cruelties, but to the Armenian question. The Russian border diplomats noted brawls that were breaking out between Armenians and Russian authorities, but most of the world was focusing on Erzurum. There, local authorities had decided to search the city's principal Armenian church. They had heard that there was a weapons-making foundry there. They found nothing, and in fact, the British consul there was convinced this was an act of provocation. It did indeed provoke some a dust-up between the authorities and church officials, and some lives were lost. In Constantinople, Armenian militants, you may already know, disrupted the Kumkapi cathedral when the patriarch was preaching. They thought he was more or less an Uncle Tom. The Sultan responded to these things by a communications blackout. Newspapers were not allowed to report, particularly Kumkapi. No telegram was allowed abroad if it mentioned it, and if Turks or Armenians dared speak of it, they risked being denounced. Out of Erzurum, reports were even worse, as the British consul there said that there was a plan, the German word is planmäßig, there is a systematic attempt to eradicate the Armenian population because the Sultan is afraid and that it is coming home. Okay, now on to the 1890s massacres. Colonel Kolmar Thunderbolt, general, who was working then to help reform the Turkish military, a Russian officer, has left a vivid picture of Abdulhamid's nervous, reputedly weak personality. He didn't argue against the commonly held view among Europeans that the Sultan was in the grips of paranoia, but he warned against underestimating his ruthlessness. For anyone who cites the Sultan's suspicion, no merit will protect. The most faithful servant will ruthlessly be tossed overboard the moment the Sultan's attention has been drawn, however accidentally, to any semblance of a threat. Those who Muhammad sees as his enemies, he persecutes to the point of annihilation. Now, historians have long accepted Goltz's assessment, or similar ones expressed by others. But this picture is categorical. As Shukru Hanef has demonstrated a few years back, when it came to opposition intellectuals loosely known as Young Turks, who began organizing about this, the Sultan's policy was to kill them off, but with kindness, with pardons, with amnesties, with stipends to help them return to their native land, with well-salaried posts, at least away from the capital. And the Sultan exercised similar forbearance, as Selim Derengel has shown, towards lower-class elements who were disruptive. When it was, I'm quoting, when it was a matter of this or that element of the Muslim population misbehaving, winning them over was always preferred to the military option, said Derengel. Thus, when troops were requested to stop a Kurdish tribe from ransacking the country around Mosul, instructions from Constantinople were quite explicit. Moderate were to be tried, military ones, quote, in order to avoid spilling Muslim blood. But for the Armenians, Goltz's observation proved a prophecy. Violence against them increased until, responding to localized acts of resistance and attacks rebellion, the made it programmatic. From 1894 to in 10 provinces, Armenians were massacred, their homes burned down, their farms and shops plundered. The latest estimate by Bedros Dermatosian supports the commonly held view about 200,000 Armenians were killed. Now, we've become so jaded by the horrors of the 20th century that we need to put these figures in contemporary perspectives. They dwarf the toll of victims of Russian violence against Jews that caused so much European outrage. During the famous pogroms of 1881, when nearly 1,000 Jewish homes were destroyed, several dozen people were killed. Even the Odessa pogrom of 1905, probably the worst collective violence against Jews during the entire pre-war period, seemed to have produced fewer than 1,000 fatalities. The huge disparity in Jewish and Armenian loss of life is explained not least by the fact that Russia's pogroms were not instigated from the throne. How can we explain this violence? Beginning with the Ottoman leadership itself, then in Turkish nationalist historiography and given academic legitimacy in the United States by scholars from William L. Langer to Stanford Shaw, a popular answer sees the massacres as the intended result of the strategy of the new Armenian Revolutionary Party. The premise of this, we call it the provocation thesis, Ron has published on this, is that Armenian militants were confident, like Samantha Power, that if public outrage were loud enough, it would force their respective governments into a kind of Victorian version of the responsibility to protect. More recently, social scientists, considering the horrors in the Balkans later, have given the provocation a new twist, leading them to examine with a critical. Borrowing from studies of the insurance industry, where analysts have suggested that owning policies against fire, for example, may encourage people to smoke in bed, thus precipitating the conflagration that insurance is intended to remedy, these scholars argue that in cases of inter-ethnic conflict, the expectation of international intervention may encourage minorities in pursuit of statehood to take risks they would otherwise have avoided, thus provoking the government to violent reprisal. Such expectations they term, and this is adopting the insurance industry's rather awkward label, moral hazard. Now, moral hazard departs from the provocation thesis by shifting the blame away from the victims to third parties, that is, to states or international bodies whose threats to brutal governments aim at preventing bloodshed, but like fire insurance, offer perverse incentives to those they are trying to protect. In practice, the provocation thesis and moral hazard arguments tend to bleed into each other, and not surprisingly, both of them blame, most of all, organized public opinion, championed by Gladstone, on which much of the legitimacy of outside intervention rests. Now, the most influential proponent of the provocation thesis here has been William L. Langer, the most eminent American historian of his day, the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Although Langer was a Europeanist, he taught a popular course on the Ottoman Empire at Harvard, thus influencing a whole generation of American leaders. Scholars noted his massive Diplomacy of Imperialism, 1890-1902, which analyzed the relation between European powers and non-European countries. Published in 1935, it was reissued 3 more times in the next 30 years and won rave reviews everywhere. And singled out in all of these reviews were his treatment of the Armenian massacres, the first scholarly treatment. Now, Langer was no Turkophile. He was a Ronkian, and therefore he thought he was impartial. And it was a point of pride for him to resist sympathizing with the underdog. He was a realist, and therefore contemptuous. Whoops, 3 minutes? Huh? Well, I'm not going to get there. Contemptuous of Gladstonianism precisely because the latter was confident in public opinion, which he considered ignorant. Langer's command of languages was legendary, and what supported his argument here, in which the Armenians had provoked these massacres in order to get intervention, was his citation of articles, pamphlets, manifestos, and autobiographies of Armenians themselves, written in the Armenian language. I suspect a graduate student read this for him, but anyway. So he makes a general argument in specific cases that The Armenians had actually tried to get violence against them, and he quotes Armenians as having said as much. But at the end, he comes out and says there is no doubt that the Sultan was behind all of these massacres, that he armed the population, local population, and encouraged them to do so and held off the police from enforcing law and order. Well, I'm going to skip over the rest of what I had hoped to say and just give you a conclusion. And my conclusion, I'm skipping over the evidence and coming to the conclusion because the conclusion is what differs from Ron Sunni's argument. My conclusion is that it did not take World War I to bring about the Armenian genocide. That we know already that this violence, 200,000 Armenians, was both hated by Europeans, protested by Europeans, but not stopped by Europeans. Nobody wanted to take over the Ottoman Empire. No one wanted to occupy it. As people have said, Napoleon said, but they've also cited about 100 other people, you do anything with bayonets, but sit upon them. They wanted stability in the Ottoman Empire, not territory. And as the Chancellor of Germany in the late 1890s wrote to his sister, they wanted to be in Turkey, but I can just see the faces on the Reichstag if I walked in and said, tomorrow we're mobilizing for an intervention in Turkey. They knew what was happening, they did not intervene. And my argument is this is indeed genocidal violence. The only thing that stopped it from going full is his point. So here, Ron and I may agree, he didn't yet have the mindset that he needed to do this. But had he wanted to do it, he could have. And I see no reason to think that that had there not been World War I, had the Young Turks that they had the Armenians as an enemy, they could have gone ahead and done what Abdul Hamid did, and I don't think anyone, not our wonderful England, our wonderful France, and certainly not our wonderful Germany, would have prevented them from doing so. It is one. What really angered the Sultan and the Ottomans was the demand for reform, and the Armenians were not going to give up on that. And reform, in all of its guises, meant simply equality. And we Americans know, as the French knew and others know, you can't decree equality even if your society gives lip service to it, which the Ottoman society did not. It took a whole bloody civil war in the United States to even put it on the books. You know, from the cases of Trayvon Martin to Walter Scott, enforcing real police equality takes a very, very long time. Had the United States been surrounded by a very powerful black country in the north, had its waters been two powerful black navies, east and west, had the Northwest been populated by black successor states who had broken away, I think the future of African Americans would have been bleaker than it was. So sorry for the truncated paper and the pessimistic conclusion.
Okay.